to this concurrent section with the theme Religion and Conflict Resolution. My name's Danoye Oguntola Laguda. I have the honor to share this session, and I have with me Jeremy Gunn, Muhammad Abdullah, and I also have Rosalind Hackett standing in for James Latigo. So, because all our panelists are already introduced in your program, I will not labor it again to introduce them. So, without much ado, let me hand over to Gunn to present his paper.
Greetings. Is this working? Doesn't sound, okay. Very good. I'm pleased to be here. Thank you for coming. When I first walked into the room, it was completely filled with people. I came up, sat down, and people then slowly left the room. I didn't know whether to take that personally or not, but let's go on in any case. A few years ago, I worked for the U.S. State Department, and at one time I was asked to be a host for a group from Nigeria. And during one of our lunch discussions, I was asked, have you ever been to Africa? And I said, well, I'm going to let you answer that question. I said, I have been to Egypt, to Morocco, and to Tunisia. So have I been to Africa? And they all together shook their heads, no, you haven't been to Africa. So now I think I can say I have been to Africa. I think that the single most important problem area in the world today on issues of religion, law, and politics involve the Muslim world. When I say that, I assume I'm not saying anything that is surprising or counterintuitive or radical, but probably something that most of us would already understand. It, of course, does not present the only series of issues and problems in the world on law and religion, but it is probably the most important. We see variations of this issue now every day in the newspapers. We cannot turn on the news without hearing this, as we all know. So the group ISIS, which claims to be a state, yesterday seized Ramadi, and from what I understand, revenge killings are taking place today, and those revenge killings are taking place in the name of Islam. So we have a group acting as a state, engaging in violence and promotion of Sharia. So if we were meeting a week ago, there would have been another example. I expect that if we were to meet in another week, we would have different examples. So this is an ongoing problem. I think that there is, however, vast misunderstandings, both within the Muslim world as well as within the non-Muslim world, about what is going on in the name of Islam. And I'd like to try to address part of that. Now, I claim no knowledge, no expertise whatsoever, and let me emphasize even knowledge on Africa generally. My knowledge of the Muslim world is somewhat limited, but I'm going to be making reference to that as part of my discussion. I now live in Morocco, where I have been teaching predominantly Muslim students for the last 6 years. One of the courses that I teach is the history of the Arab world. I also have a group of students who we call them at the university, we call them our imams. These are students who have had classical Islamic education, and then they are sent to the university where I teach to obtain a graduate degree in Islamic studies. And it is designed to be studies about more of an interdisciplinary approach to, or a liberal arts approach to Islam in the world. So they will be taking classes on Islam and politics, which I teach to them. They will be taking comparative religion courses, anthropology of religion, so courses that they have not taken at all as part of their education. And I go through some of the issues that I'll be talking about with you today with them. So my frame of reference comes partly from this. and the practical experiences that I have had in working with these scholars. I'd like to suggest that there are largely three areas of misunderstanding, and I think, again, these are both within the Muslim world and from outside the Muslim world about Islam. So I'd like to address these, and this will be brief and an overview. First one is different meanings of the term Sharia. So I'll come back to that. The second one is the relationship between religion and violence. And the third issue that I'd like to talk about, again, where I think that there are misunderstandings, are about religion and the secular state. So those three issues, I'll treat them all reasonably briefly. With regard to different meanings of Sharia, I'd like to suggest that there are essentially four different meanings that become confused in people's minds. When I say these four meanings, I'm not claiming any originality with this, but I do think that this is the source of a great deal of misunderstanding. The first meaning of Sharia would be the law of God. The law of God is absolute, it is perfect, it is without error, and it is unchanging. It is God's law. Perfect. That is one of the meanings of Sharia, and as far as I can see, that comes, although my definition is not pretty or beautiful, but that comes closest to the correct meaning of Sharia. There is a second one, which is human interpretation of what this Sharia is. A more accurate term for this would be fiqh, which would be human understanding of divine law. And let's make clear that there is an enormous difference between those two. Human beings are fallible, they make mistakes, sometimes they are careless when they make their mistakes, sometimes they are made in good faith, but it is the human understanding of divine law. It is changeable, and it does change, has changed during the course of Islam. I think very few Muslims today would be able to live easily under the law as it was applied during the Umayyad or Abbasid dynasties. It was rather different from the way that it is now. Whether it's called Sharia then or called fiqh, either one, it is different from how Islam is practiced today. In Morocco, the country where I live, Islam is practiced in the 21st century, differs pretty significantly from the way that it was practiced even 100 years ago. Whereas my students would, if they were to be transported back in time and talk to their great-grandparents, they would think of their great-grandparents as living under many superstitions and folkloric beliefs, things that have nothing to do with Islam, but that would have been what was practiced at the time. So this human understanding of Sharia changes over time, so let's keep that in mind. A third approach to Sharia is what I would call the symbols and rhetoric of Islam. So it will be statements made about Islam. So states, for example, today, more than 50 states in the Muslim world will use, 30 states in the Muslim world will use terms such as the laws of the state are guided by Sharia, so that the state laws are the origins or come from Sharia, or they will be interpreted in light of Sharia. There will be many states that say that Islam is the religion of the state. And we can say that, that this comes not only from states where we might think of them as being theological states, such as, using terms very loosely, such as Iran or Saudi Arabia or Sudan. So not states like that, but sometimes very secular states. So Nasser, for example, coming into power in Egypt in 1952, 1953, starts using Islamic terms as well. If you remember, just before Saddam Hussein was executed, he was carrying the Quran in his hands. Ba'athists will use these. So it's using symbols of Islam, maybe having nothing to do with people who are pious Muslims who are leading the state, but the people who are adopting those. Islamists, as they come into power, sometimes briefly, sometimes for a more extended period of time, will insist on this language of Islam being incorporated within the state. A fourth one that I would like to talk about, maybe it is a particular example, is what would be called elsewhere the personal law, or the law of the family, or the family code, depending on what the region is. And it will often be assumed that the place where Sharia should be, where Sharia is in fact applied more than any other place, is with respect to the family code. So it will be either the rights or the lack of rights of women, issues related to divorce, related to marriage, to inheritance, to child support, all of those issues. And so states often will be promoting Sharia, but when you actually look into what does Sharia mean, it does not include the hudud punishments for violating the law, but it means laws on the family. So that will be taken as Sharia. In a conference that Cole Durham and I were at a year and a half ago or so, though my mind may be a little bit off on that, one professor from India gave a review of Sharia around the world. And he talked about how states have implemented Sharia. And almost without exception, every state that he described as implementing Sharia, it was family code. It was laws of the family, women, divorce. That's what Sharia meant in those states. So now those different meanings of them can be confused. The problem, of course, is when they become confused, the assumption that if we're talking about symbols of the state that we call Sharia, that is somehow confused with God's law, or that people's interpretation is confused with law. That ends up meaning, conceivably, people end up committing violence in the name of Islam, not to support what is actually God's law, but a particular interpretation of God's law. One would hope that people who are serious about the religion and understand that God's law is not entirely knowable by human beings would have a degree of modesty or some kind of reluctance to speak for the greater law. Let's move on to the second issue that I wanted to talk about, which is religion and violence. Now, Islam is often portrayed as violent, as we've already talked about, and I've given you some examples. We hear the cases of people being executed for blasphemy. We hear cases of people being executed for supposed conversion to Christianity. So this is sort of an assumption that we make now. Now, religion and violence have been associated from the beginning of religion, beginning of the state. Religion is associated with violence. There's no question about that. But Islam's association, and Islam has been associated with violence as well, some very barbaric acts, as is the case in other religions. But our modern notion of Islam being associated with violence really is a post-1979 phenomenon. It largely doesn't exist before then. Again, there are always examples. But that's the year that it started. If you look to try to find examples of violence being done in a spectacular way in the name of Islam, you're not going to find them before 1979. 1979 is when it starts. First with the seizure of the U.S. Embassy, which is probably a minor example, but then much more dramatically with the seizure of the Grand Mosque in Mecca by an Islamist group that goes into the mosque in Mecca and is responsible for killing, not even known, somewhere between a few hundred and a few thousand human beings, all in the name of Islam, all in the name of the return of the Mahdi. When we think of groups like Hezbollah and Hamas, those are phenomena of the 1980s. First suicide attack in the name of Islam, 1983. That's fairly recently. This is a new phenomenon. Even the violence that took place in the 1990s, of which there were many examples, it would be violence that we would hear of once every 2 or 3 years, not on a daily basis as we have it now. So something has happened in this. Unfortunately, that there are now people in the world outside of Islam who want to say that Islam is a religion of violence. What they're looking at is a very recent phenomenon. Unfortunately, some of the best supporters for Islam being a religion of violence are Muslims who happen to agree with the strongest opponents. So the supporters of violence within Islam end up supporting those who are outside of Islam. The final point that I wanted to make reference to is the secular state. With my students, I frequently have the case as we start the semester that they look upon the religious state, as in Morocco, as being the friend of Islam, and the secular state as being the enemy of Islam, so the anti-religious secular state. So we go through a process of discussing this, and among other things we say, well, can the state go on the Hajj? Of course, the answer to that is no, and they think that's a funny question. Can a state go to heaven or to paradise? No, of course, that's a funny question, too. Can the state be pious? And the answer to that, no, of course, the state cannot be pious. What the real concern is not whether the state is religious or the state has the symbols and imagery of Islam. The real question for the state is whether the state is doing something that helps human beings go to paradise, find enlightenment, go to heaven, be saved. That's the thing, is the state helping or hurting? And we can ask the question, to what extent can the state actually do things to help people go to heaven? If the state prohibits the sale of alcohol, but the people want to drink it anyway, is that going to help them go to heaven? And again, we come up with the answer, no. If people are being coerced into following religious law, that doesn't help them at all. So how do we then solve this issue? I mean, what can the state do that is best for helping people go to heaven? That should be the goal of religion, heaven or nirvana or whatever the religious tradition is. And the best answer that we can come up with is the state should allow people to have freedom to practice their own beliefs. The state should not be making those decisions. Once the state starts saying that it has a preference for one religion over another, or promoting particular views, we're more likely to see the state becoming hypocritical and the politicians using religion to advance their politics and not religion being used to help people go to heaven. So whether we have the case of Berlusconi suddenly becoming pious and promoting crucifixes in the classroom, or we have Berlusconi who is using crucifixes in the classroom to develop support and distract attention, maybe that's what the issue is that is going on. The goal then being, what we should be looking for is establishing rules within a state that allow people to make their own decisions individually and with their co-religionists to make their own decisions and find their own salvation in that way. So these three areas of, I think, misunderstanding, both within the Muslim world and outside the Muslim world, not particularly radical or extreme, but it would be useful, I think, to think of those as we try to understand the greater issues. Thank you.
Thank you very much.